Attention to orders. Tonight we want to open up our ceremony with a moment of silence and prayer. Deputy Jack Pickett, age 30, of the Boone County Sheriff's Department in Indiana, was shot at 9:40 a.m. this morning by a suspect. He was shot in the head. He is not expected to recover, and at this point in time, he is on life support. He will continue to serve his fellow man by donating his organs. We will not read his name as deceased tonight. He is still with us, and he is still serving in that capacity. So if you would, remove your covers for a moment of silence. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our first responders, Lord. We ask you, watch over them, keep them firmly in your hands, Lord. We thank you for Officer Pickett, for his life of service to our cities. Lord, for the city of Lebanon, who's had such a hard week with the death of a councilman, the death of a teenager, and now the shooting of this officer. Lord, we ask you to be with all of the officers of duty tonight, all of our fire, and all of those. We pray this in the precious name. Amen.
This week's killed in action: Sergeant Joseph Nordstrom, U.S. Army; Lieutenant James Mazzelli, U.S. Navy; Sergeant Christina Schumacher, U.S. Army. Local and Indiana veterans: Edward Lewis Mode, U.S. Navy, World War II and Korea; James Anderson, U.S. Army medic, World War II, Indy Honor Flight; Kenneth Kahn, U.S. Air Force; John Bedell, U.S. Army; Tilson King, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II; James Teeler, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam; Alfred Stovall, U.S. Army; Ernest Shields, U.S. Army; Brett Egan, Army National Guard; Max Bedwell, U.S. Navy; Donald Kramer, U.S. Navy, Korea; David Josie, U.S. Army, Korea; Leslie McClure, U.S. Army, World War II; Larry Bogman, U.S. Navy; Donald Byrd, U.S. Army; Fred Frey, U.S. Army; Leonard Goss, U.S. Army; Edward Kubanowski, U.S. Army, Vietnam; Alan Walker, U.S. Army; Wayne Young, U.S. Army; Charles Halter, U.S. Army, World War II; Jim Richard, U.S. Army, Korea; Ray Gordon, U.S. Merchant Marine, World War II; Kenneth Barnes, U.S. Army, Vietnam; Lloyd Perry, U.S. Air Force; Stephen Frey, U.S. Navy; Kenneth Holtzmeyer, U.S. Army; Stephen Fossmeyer, U.S. Air Force; James Dunn, U.S. Army; Charles Guy, U.S. Marines; Douglas Heron, U.S. Army; Samuel Finnegan, U.S. Army, Vietnam; Miles Usay, U.S. Navy, Vietnam; Marvin Taylor, U.S. Army; Bernard Brown, U.S. Army, Korea; Robert Matt Garrett, U.S. Marines, Korea; Willis Rose, U.S. Army, World War II, Indy Honor Flight; John Howell, U.S. Marines, World War II; Franklin Helton, U.S. Air Force; Charles Ingell, U.S. Army, World War II; Lester Toller, U.S. Air Force; Robert Corbin, U.S. Army, Vietnam; Joseph Todd, U.S. Army, World War II and Korea; Richard English, U.S. Army; Harry Benningham, U.S. Army, Korea; James Douglas, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam; Herbert DePoy, U.S. Army, World War II; Frank Crito, U.S. Army; Billy Knopp, U.S. Army, Korea; Daniel Williams, U.S. Army, Korea; David Keith, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Keith Robbins, U.S. Army, World War II. Donald Coombs, U.S. Army. Neil Gainley, U.S. Army, Korea. Other veterans around the nation. Norman Boyle, Sr., U.S. Marines. Marta Schoonover, U.S. Army. Harold Harrison, U.S. Army. Ralph Smith, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Steve Madvin, U.S. Air Force, Korea. Dale Duncan, U.S. Army. Russell Anderson, U.S. Army. Bobby Shirley, U.S. Army. Clarence Long, U.S. Army. Homer Glover, U.S. Navy. Gabriel Ledzier, U.S. Navy. William Collier, U.S. Army. Francis Kohnauer, U.S. Army. William Rawson, U.S. Navy. Michael Stroop, U.S. Army. Thomas Hamilton, U.S. Air Force. Roger Hink, U.S. Army. William Cosile, U.S. Army. Deanna Fisher, U.S. Army. Police and fire killed in the line of duty. Deputy Stephen Goss, Morgan County Sheriff's Office, Indiana. Donald Shipe, Ashland Fire Department, Ashland, Indiana. Sergeant Mark Baserman, Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Rosie the Riveters. Dorothea Anderson. Jermaine Bollinger. Mary Schumer. Marjorie Drake. Elaine Ellsworth. Barbara Goss. Haiti James. Fry Laverne. Wilma McWilliams. Arlene Melkison. Lorraine Miller. Nellie Nelson. Loretta Powell. And Emma Zuli. MIAs and POWs recently recovered. Army PFC Lamar Newman, 19, of Griffin, Georgia, missing in action November 27, 1950, recovered October 2000, and identified February of this year. Marine Corporal Reserve PFC Arnold Harrison, 19, of Detroit, Michigan, killed in action November 30th, 1943, recovered January of 2017, and identified February of this year. Army Lieutenant Colonel Robert Knopp, missing in action in Vietnam, missing in action 1965, remains recovered in 2017, and identified February of this year. Army PFC Roy Bryant, 22, of Annenberg, Georgia, died as a POW in North Korea, February of 1941. Recovered in 1954 and identified February of this year.